badly off the board. That looks a bit better. I think that will do. So today we're looking at verbs, and I want to show, well, I want to talk a little bit about word classes. I want to talk a little bit about category and about function, which are two topics that I've spoken about before. And I think it's very important to always see things in terms of category and function with grammar, because a lot of words are quite tricky when we're doing word classes. So what is a verb? Well, I would define a verb as a word that always has a doer, a word that always has a subject. A subject is another name for a doer. And one thing, well, verbs and subjects and objects are now taught at primary school. And actually, it's not a simple theme, but they make the kids do questions about subjects, verbs, objects, and identifying adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions in year 6. So we're going to look, and we're going to do that today as well. We will look at word classes, and I'll see if I can give you some advice on how to identify word classes, especially as so many kids are sitting at home with their parents doing these exercises. And I'm not sure people realise how difficult some of these exercises are. But still, I'm pleased that we're doing a lot of grammar with the young kids, but I want to try to demystify some parts of grammar, especially verbs. So verbs always have a doer, by my definition, and I think there are many other people that would agree. A verb always has a subject. Now, if a verb doesn't have a subject, but you can see that that word is definitely a verb, well, we'll look at this in a moment with 2 examples. But if a verb doesn't have a subject, it's still categorized in the dictionary as a verb, but it functions in that sentence very often as either a noun or an adjective, in which case it's not really a verb anymore. It's functioning as a noun or an adjective. And the nouns we call gerunds and the adjectives we call participles. But let's have a look at this. Let's see what I'm talking about, because it's actually a very big difference sometimes. So the kind of questions that they give the kids in year 6, I took these 3 questions from a sheet of paper which I had in my hand a second ago that the teachers at the local primary school gave my son. And the question was, identify the subjects, objects, verbs, nouns, prepositions, determiners, conjunctions, every part of speech in these 3 sentences, which is actually really tricky. And so we'll go through it. I mean, it is possible, it's doable, and I'm glad we're introducing kids to these ideas, but I want to show how tricky that is and how many times it's actually quite debatable. Okay, so let's stick with this idea that a verb always has a doer, and if it doesn't have a doer, then it's not a verb. Here are 2 examples. The witness named the killer. This named is a verb. Yeah, it has a doer. Somebody did the naming. Somebody named the killer. Who? The witness. So we call the witness subject. We call the killer object. It's the object of the verb named. And named is 100% a verb, and it's functioning in the classic way that a verb does. It has a subject and it has an object. Verbs don't have to have objects. We have intransitive verbs that don't need objects. And so verbs don't always have an object, but they do always have a subject. And I really emphasize that point, because look at sentence number 2. The witness named Dave stood up. Now, I hope you can see that this named is completely different from the first named. The witness didn't name me. Yeah, he didn't say it was Dave, like in number 1, where the witness said he was the killer. He named the killer. Billy was the killer, something like that. He named the killer. But in the second one, the witness didn't name Dave. He didn't say Dave was the killer or anything like that. The witness was called Dave. The witness's name was Dave. This named is describing the witness. This named is what the witness did. So this named is a verb, it's got a doer. This named is not a verb, it doesn't have a doer, and technically it's a participle. It's made from the verb to name, so it comes from that form, it's made from that root form, but it functions as an adjective. So we may categorize named as a verb in most dictionaries, but it functions in this sentence as an adjective, and that's what we call a participle, a verb phrase functioning as an adjective. Okay, and that's a very subtle point, but it's important because in this second sentence, this is the verb stood. This has got a doer. It's got the witness stood. So you can see that there's a massive difference here, and it's very important, and I've spoken about it on a few different occasions. Yeah, I think I used the cars made in Japan, yeah, are expensive, or, in that sentence, made, nobody made anything. The cars certainly didn't make anything. But if you say, I made a cake, made has got a doer, it's not an adjective. So there's a big difference between these two parts of speech, and it's quite subtle, and it will be tricky for a year 6 kid to understand this subtle difference, for sure. But I think at senior school they are ready to learn about participles for sure, and it actually comes in really handy. Writers love participles. So that's the main important thing that I first want to get across, that there is a difference between a verb and a participle. Okay, so some other information about verbs, how to spot them. Well, verbs often show tense and aspect, okay? So the aspects are simple, continuous, perfect and perfect continuous, and the tenses are past, present and future. Now, you might argue, as many have done, that English doesn't really have a future tense or something. I'm not going to go into those details. For me, this is a nice, simple way of approaching tenses, and recognizing that there's a past, a present and a future, and recognizing that there's a simple form, a continuous, a perfect and a perfect continuous, and you can see all those forms in that table. Now, if you're interested in stuff like this, I do go through all of these points in this book. This is my book, and you can buy it on Amazon for £16 as paperback, or you can buy it from me by getting in touch with me by writing me an email, and it's £12 for the PDF. But all of these points are gone through in detail, and I try to teach you how to spot these things in literature, because it's in literature that you find the best sentences. Okay, so verbs have tense, verbs have aspect, and this means that very often when you see a verb, you don't just see one word sitting there on its own, you see 3 words or 4 words in a chain. And when that happens, you usually call the first 2 verbs auxiliary verbs, and the last one is the main verb. But be aware that verbs often come in chains. Firstly, because of tense and aspect. Secondly, because of passive and active. All of these, or certainly the first 3 aspects, they all have passive forms. You can say was lived, was being lived, had been lived, and they're passive forms, and they also have auxiliary verbs, and they also appear in long chains. Okay, so that means that we often see verbs in long chains as well. And lastly, you get catenated verbs, which are things like I need to go to see the doctor. You got 3 verbs in a row there, need, to go, to see. So you can get chains of catenated verbs as well. Okay, and a few other things about verbs. One exception to when verbs don't have a doer, but they're still verbs, is the imperative. When we say go, wait, stop, don't come in, yeah, don't do that, then you don't have a doer. That's the one exception to our rule of verbs always have a doer. But I would argue that when you say don't come in, you do mean you don't come in, and so the doer is implied, but it's not explicit in the imperative, in orders. Okay, so please be aware of that. This is one exception to our earlier definition of verbs always have a doer. Okay, so that's an exception, and be aware of the subjunctive. This is like if I were, not if I was, but if I were a rich man. You can say if I was, but it's nowhere near as formal as if I were. If I were sounds very royal, and the subjunctive form, which is why we say if I were, it sounds very formal, it sounds very royal. So this is one more form of the verb to be aware of. Now, I've already mentioned auxiliaries. We use auxiliaries to make tenses, questions, passives, negatives. For all of these reasons, you'll see auxiliary verbs, and they're good to be aware of because very often if you're looking for a verb, You very often see an auxiliary verb with that verb. So it's good to be aware of what they are. Modal verbs are a type of auxiliary verb, and modal verbs are weird because they don't change form. What I mean is most verbs you say I go, he goes, I play, he plays. But with modal verbs you don't. You say I can, he can, I will, he will, I would, he would. So that's what a modal verb is. It's a verb that doesn't have different forms. Most verbs you can make participles: going, playing, having, swimming. But you can't with modal verbs. You can't say canning, wooding, musting, shoulding. None of them work. So that's what a modal verb is. And copular verbs I've mentioned a few times recently, because if you're doing parts of speech, understanding that a copular verb takes an adjective after it and not an adverb is very useful information. Okay, and so that's usually why I speak about copular verbs and talk about how they're different from ordinary verbs. Now let's do a little bit of parts of speech practice. This is what they're making the poor kids do with their parents at home, and I'm glad they are, because I think grammar is a very useful thing. But I want to show that it's actually, there will be some words which really the kids will struggle with, and I'm sure the parents struggle with, and I'm not entirely sure that the teachers always appreciate, for example, the difference between a verb and a participle, and they are different things. It will be useful to separate these two things, especially if they go on to learn foreign languages. It's actually very useful to see that they are different things if you're going to speak in a foreign language. So let's have a look at number one. The filthy dog ran through the house, leaving dirty footprints on the floor. And the kids have got to name every part of speech. So let's go through this. Now, we've done a lesson on determiners recently. So hopefully you've just got a and the memorized as determiners, because that's the best way to deal with determiners. Memorize the list of them: numbers, possessive pronouns, a and the, possessive names, Peters, Johns, and quantifiers: some, any, few, little, much, many. Yeah, you've got most of them covered if you just remember that list. And remember that determiners always identify the noun, so they're always before a noun. Now, it may not be right before it, because this is the noun, dog. You all know dog is a thing, and this is describing the dog, so it must be an adjective. Adjectives describe nouns, but be clear with kids that adverbs also describe, but they don't describe nouns. They describe everything else. Yeah, so we've got a determiner, an adjective, and then a noun, and then the verb here, ran. And I was pleased that Mike, my son, managed to find this verb. Excellent. Now, this is 100% a verb because it's got a doer. The dog was the one that ran, yeah? So this is 100% a verb, but I want you to compare this to a word later in the sentence which looks like a verb but doesn't function like a verb. Okay, so we got verb, and then we got through. Now, through always has a noun after it: through the forest, through the river, through the crowd, which is telling you that it's a preposition. That's what prepositions do. They set up a relationship to one noun, or maybe several nouns actually, but they set up a relationship to a noun, and so that's what they're followed by. So if you have a word like in or on or with that's always followed by a noun, you've got a preposition. So we've got preposition, and then as always, determiner, noun. Yeah, you normally see determiner and then a noun. Okay, so we've got the filthy dog ran through the house. Then we've got this word leaving. Now, my son thought that this was a verb, and to leave, it looks like a verb, doesn't it? It really does look like a verb. And of course, there is a verb: to leave. I leave, he leaves, I am I am leaving, I was leaving, I had left, I had been leaving. You can put it into lots of different tenses. That's showing you that it sometimes functions as a verb. But is it a verb here? Does it have a subject? Does it say he was leaving the house, or the dog was leaving the house? No, it doesn't. It just says the dog, leaving dirty footprints on the floor, ran through the house. Yeah, the dog leaving dirty footprints on the floor. So this leaving dirty footprints on the floor is what we call a participle phrase. It's a phrase. It doesn't have a subject and a verb. You want more information on phrases and clauses, it's all in here, and it's on lots of different lessons that I've made for YouTube as well. But this is a phrase, and it's a phrase that describes the dog. It describes the dog. What was the dog doing? He was leaving dirty footprints on the floor. But we don't have the was there. It doesn't say the dog was leaving dirty footprints on the floor. If it says the dog was leaving dirty footprints on the floor, we got a verb. We got was leaving is our verb and the dog is our subject. But if you just say the dog, leaving dirty footprints on the floor, ran through the house, leaving is not a verb then. Okay, now you might choose to say leaving is a non-finite verb and ran is a finite verb. You might choose to describe it like that, but I don't think that's very useful or very clear for a young learner. I think it's much more useful and much clearer to simply explain that this one doesn't have a doer. For this one to have a doer, you need to say the dog was leaving. But this one doesn't have a doer. It describes the dog. So this is a participle. And that's why really, I'm not sure what the year 6 teachers want. I'm not sure if they will say that that's a verb or if they will say that that's an adjective. Really, it's both. It's categorized as a verb, but it's functioning as an adjective. And so the difference, categorically it's a verb, but in terms of function, it's an adjective. So we call it a participle. So this is tricky, and it's worth talking to youngsters and explaining the difference between verbs and participles for this reason, but it's not an easy thing to do. So we've got a participle here, and then all the others are easy. We've got dirty footprints, adjective, noun, and then a typical prepositional phrase. Through the house is a prepositional phrase, yeah? Through the house is a prepositional phrase. On the floor is a prepositional phrase. So this is a typical prepositional phrase. Preposition, determiner, noun. Okay? So look out for these prepositional phrases. They're usually things like over the fence, under the chair, round the street. You normally see preposition, determiner, noun. Let's look at number 2. The old doll had only one eye open and her hair had fallen out. Now I remember that my son put this word down as a verb and this word down as a verb. And of course he's right about this one. But is he right about this one? Well, I can understand why he would immediately think opening something is an action, because it is, yeah? And closing something is an action. It is. To open is a verb, to close is a verb. But is it a verb in this sentence? Let's look at it. The old doll had only one eye open. Okay, so we've got a determiner, an adjective and a noun. It must be a determiner, it's identifying that doll. It must be an adjective, it's describing that doll. The doll's a thing. It's the subject of the next word, which is the verb. This is the verb here, had, to have. And this is the subject, yeah, the doer. The old doll had. And then we've got only, which is an adverb. So that's a tricky one, but if you know that adverbs end in ly, you might get there a lot faster. But really it's because it modifies when you say I only came 5 minutes late. It modifies the verb. Yeah, you came only 5 minutes late, or in fact it modifies 5 minutes late. It's modifying, it's making that only 5 minutes late. Yeah. So yeah, this is an adverb, and then we've got a number. Numbers are determiners. They're quantifying the next word, which is a noun. So we've got a determiner, then we've got a noun, and then we've got this word open. Now, open's normally a verb, I agree. And if you say he opened the door, then it's a verb. But if you say my eyes open, isn't open describing the eyes? My eyes closed. Isn't closed describing the eyes? And that's why really, again, we've got here an adjective. This one eye open, just like one eye shut. This open is an adjective here. Yeah, what a nasty question to give to a poor year 6 child, yeah? But really, this is the case. If you say one eye open, one eye closed, you are describing that eye with this word. So, one open eye, one eye open. It's not acting as a verb. It's not the eye opened something. And it's not I opened my eyes. It's not functioning as a verb with a doer. It's just describing a noun. And so that makes this word a particularly tricky word. It does look like a verb, I agree, but it's actually an adjective. It's only a verb when the eye opens something. Then it's a verb, but eyes don't open anything, do they? They haven't got hands and fingers, and so they can't open anything. But you could say, I opened my eyes, or the doctor opened the patient's eye, maybe he pulled the eyelids up, yeah, the doctor opened the patient's eyes, then it's an action, but it's got to be an action, a verb, it's got to have a doer. Otherwise it's an adjective. So you can see that they're giving some very tricky questions to the youngsters, which is good, but yeah, some of these words to explain exactly how they're functioning in the sentence is not easy. So yeah, this is an adjective. Then we've got a conjunction, and best just to learn the fanboys conjunctions. Really do learn those words, they're so useful. I can't believe I was never taught about fanboys and subordinating conjunctions. I'm astonished, being honest, now I'm an adult. But they do teach this now in primary school, and learning the fanboys and the subordinating conjunctions will really make it easy to punctuate your essays and your emails. So if you want more information about fanboys conjunctions and subordinating conjunctions, please buy my book. You can get in touch with me if you prefer, or you can buy it on Amazon for £16, but the electronic version's only £12. Okay, so we've got conjunction, her, hair, determiner, noun. Yeah, possessive pronouns are determiners. Don't forget that, just memorize it. Possessive pronouns identify the noun. So that's a determiner, that's a noun. Now Mike's right that this is a verb, but he missed the auxiliary verb, which is fine. I think he's done well to get fallen, and I expect youngsters to see the main verb rather than the auxiliary verb. But this is making the tense past perfect. Yeah, it's past perfect tense, had lived, had fallen. So this is an auxiliary verb, this is the main verb. And then we got this word, out. Now normally, or very often, out is a preposition. But when a preposition doesn't have an object, the easier route to take is to call it an adverb. It's describing where the verb happened. The hair fell where the hair fell, out. It didn't fall up, it didn't fall down, it didn't fall in, it fell out. So it's describing the verb fall. So let's call it an adverb, and I recommend doing that with any preposition that doesn't have an object. It's the most straightforward approach. Okay, lastly, a brave mouse scurried quickly across the hall from a hole in the corner, despite the cat being in the same room. Most of this is pretty straightforward. We've got a determiner, an adjective, a noun, and then a verb, which you can see is a verb because it's in the past tense, and it's a verb because it's got a doer. The mouse scurried. Then we got an adverb, and you can guess that it's an adverb because of the ly, but it's describing the verb scurried. He scurried quickly, yeah? So keep an eye out for ly and adverbs. Now, across always has a noun after it, across the room, across the field, across the river. So it's a preposition for that reason. Prepositions are followed by nouns. Then we've got a determiner, and then we've got a noun. And then we've got another word which is always followed by a noun. From a hole, from my mum, from London. It's always followed by a noun, so it's another preposition. Preposition, determiner, noun. Very common pattern. Be ready for preposition, determiner, noun, because we're going to get it again. In is always followed by a noun. In the house, in the box, in the river. So we've got preposition, determiner, noun again. Okay? And then we've got a comma, and we've got the word despite. Now, when you think about it, despite is always followed by a noun. Yeah, despite my mistake, despite the weather, despite my bad marks. Despite's always followed by a noun, which means that despite is a preposition. And I think that that's a very difficult one to give the youngsters, because what is it actually followed by here, despite the cats being in the same room? Well, it's followed by a noun and then a description of that noun. I think it's tricky because of this word being. I think it looks a little bit like a conjunction here, although I'm well aware that it's not a conjunction. Despite's always followed by a noun and not by a clause, but I could understand how a youngster might think that that's a clause. For it to be a clause, it would have to be the cat was in the same room, but the cat being in the same room is just a phrase, and actually this whole part is just a noun phrase, the cat being in the same room. Yeah, despite the cat being in the same room. So this is a preposition, and it's tricky to explain why, but really the main reason is it's always followed by a noun. But in this sentence, I must admit that that long phrase looks a little bit like a clause, and that would be tricky. So we've got preposition, and then we've got determiner, then we've got noun. So what the hell is this word being? Well, this is very difficult to go into the details of, because there are two ways we could write this. We could say the cats being in the same room, or we could say the cat being in the same room. The cats being in the same room, in my opinion, is more logical. It's more grammatically correct, but it's certainly not often used at all, and in fact very rarely used. And I've written the one which was written on the question and which is more often heard, which is despite the cat being in the same room. So you might hear an apostrophe, you might see in old literature an apostrophe s on the end of the cat. Now, I'm not sure I want to go into detail of why that is at the moment. You'd have to find out a lot more about participles and gerunds, and I haven't mentioned gerunds much today, so I won't go into detail there. But this word being, it looks a lot like a participle at the moment. Yeah, it's describing the cat. Where was the cat? The cat was in the same room. So the cat being in the same room. Yeah, you could understand it like that. But if you have an apostrophe s here, which is kind of more grammatically correct in old English, but in modern English nobody does this, and so I don't suggest that you do. If you have an apostrophe s there, it becomes possessive, and this is a gerund. It's a noun and not a participle, which is an adjective describing the cat. Okay, so but let's come back to what we had. We had it as just the cat being in the same room, in which case this is a noun, this is a participle, and then we've got preposition, determiner, adjective, noun. Okay, so I'm trying to just demonstrate how tricky this stuff is that we're giving to the year sixes, which is good. I like the fact that we're challenging them with parts of speech. But do be aware, if you're a primary school teacher, and I'm sure that many of the teachers are aware, that there's nothing easy about, you know, words like that. And if you're expecting them to just straight away say verb and that's it, well, you ought to make it clear that it's a little bit different from the main verb, the real verb in the sentence, which is ran, and that's the real verb because it's got a doer. Leaving doesn't have a doer, so there are a lot of nuances to be aware of. And yeah, even things like down here, despite, I'd be very surprised if some kids labeled that as a preposition immediately, because it doesn't look so much like a preposition. Yeah, it shows that we're certainly challenging the kids when they're at home with these kind of questions. Okay, so thanks everybody for watching. If you have any questions about parts of speech, please put them under the video. And if you want to learn more about parts of speech, please buy my book. It's on Amazon for £16, but you can get the electronic version by going to my email. You can see it nice and clear there at the top, sethpecksniff99@gmail.com. Or just put your name under the video and say that I would like to buy a copy. But I will leave a link to my PayPal address where you can just send me money and I will send it directly to your email. I'll do it the same day. It doesn't take me long at all. It takes me 2 minutes. So if you are interested in buying this book, just get in touch and I'll make sure you get a copy. But if you prefer paperback, I understand, so do I. Please go to Amazon and buy a copy. So thanks everyone for watching. Please like, subscribe and all the rest of it, and I hope to see you all soon.